Good morning and welcome, everybody. Yeah, I'm trying to get... I don't usually have this many guests in the room. It's a logistical nightmare for me in here. We have joining us in studio right now Jonathan Keller, who's the CEO of the California Family Council. Good morning and welcome.
Good morning. Thanks for having us on.
There we go. Now
is that a little better?
Yeah, that's
good
better.
Morning. Thanks for having us.
It's a pleasure to have you here. Also joining us is Matt Sharp, an attorney with Alliance Defending Freedom.
Good morning.
Good to have you with us. And also, Laura Haynes is here, who is a licensed clinical psychologist and a PhD. And we wanted to talk about, I ran into Greg Burt the other day on Wednesday, and he caught me and said, hey, if you're willing, there's another measure that is being proposed in the state legislature that we've got to talk about. It's Assembly Bill 2943. And the brief explanation he gave to me, I have to be honest, kind of gave me a chill. And it is, again, an effort by Democratic legislators, not just, I don't think, to promote the transgender movement, but am I wrong to think that their effort is, in large measure, to delegitimize Christianity?
I know that sounds like a scare tactic, Phil, but in this case, I really think it's not. We've kind of joked before that in a lot of ways, the church is under attack. You know, there's a culture war and different things like that. But in this case, I think you are actually seeing the California legislature move to use the coercive power of government to say what churches can and cannot say.
Yeah, at the very least, it's an effort to silence Christians.
Absolutely.
And any sort of Christian philosophy. If you could, Matt, you're the attorney here, give us the high points. What does 2943 seek to achieve?
Yeah, it's ultimately a restriction on speech. When it comes to discussions of sexual identity, sexual orientation, gender identity, it says that this is now a fraudulent practice to engage in this. And so whether you're a church holding a conference where you're discussing these issues, you could see a bookstore selling a book helping people address some of these issues, counselors wanting to help a middle-aged mom that's struggling with some confusion. All of this is now banned under this act and puts churches and counselors, bookstores, authors at risk of a lawsuit just for speaking on these issues.
So in the state of California, the only position that one can express, if consideration is involved, if you have to pay fees to go to a conference or if you're buying a book or if you're paying for counseling, the only acceptable viewpoint is that you must be on board with the transgender movement.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It is a one-way street. And
you have to embrace it or shut up.
Exactly.
What are the penalties involved?
So this involves lawsuits. And so someone can go after a church or counselor or someone else, not just for damages, punitive damages, which can be who knows how much, injunctive relief, attorney's fees. And so this can be crippling for a church, counselor, or other organization.
Dr. Haynes, if I could get you to slide in here and maybe share on this mic. Go ahead and pull your chair up. Mm-hmm. You do this for a living. And I'm just curious to know, in your experience, what is the efficacy of counseling somebody who may be confused about gender? Is it possible that they may just be confused?
Well, the APA Handbook of Sexuality and Psychology says that both sexual orientation and gender identity are not just biologically determined. There are psychological causes. In fact, it does say sexual abuse could be involved or family pathology. So what we do is we treat these life-changing experiences that people feel they have had that has affected their sexual attractions or behavior or their gender identity or expression. And when we treat those life-changing events, their sexual orientation or gender identity changes as a byproduct.
Is this this kind of confusion? My guess, as a layperson, and I have no idea, I could be completely wrong about this, is that is much more common among adolescents who are struggling with sexual feelings to begin with. Am I wrong about that?
Well, actually, it's more common in children than adolescents.
Really?
In that the vast majority of children who are gender confused will come to embrace their body by adolescence or adulthood. The APA Handbook of Sexuality and Psychology, which the American Psychological Association has given its imprimatur and declared authoritative, says that as many, at least 75%, will change. In the American Psychiatric Association, in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, says that as many as 98% of boys and 88% of girls will come to embrace their body, their body, if allowed to, if not socially transitioned. And the APA handbook recommends and cautions not to socially transition children at school or in the community, because doing so could affect their natural resolution of their gender distress.
Well, and this leads to a whole host of other issues, which includes, and I think this is the issue Greg and I were talking about the other day, the administration of hormonal treatments to young kids and blocking their puberty,
which can sterilize them for life.
And that's the big issue as far as I'm concerned, in addition to the fact that I think most gender confusion is just a delusion that should not be indulged. When we start treating kids with hormones, we have no idea yet what the long-term effects would be. I think medical science has such a fuzzy understanding of hormones to begin with, that to just cavalierly give them to children, this is a growing issue, and I'm stunned to hear you say that the profession says you should not socially transition kids, because, as we saw in Rockland last year, that appears to be the social trend right now, is that you have to embrace the transition to whatever gender that child seems to believe they are at the moment.
The handbook, APA handbook, also says that if you socially transition the children and then they come to embrace their body, the distress of a second social transition has been shown to be substantial.
Well, and under this law, even if the child decides later to embrace their body, you would not be allowed to counsel them to embrace that change, would you?
That's correct. And this leads not only to cross-sex hormones, which cannot be a healthy thing to do to somebody's body. It also leads to removing girls' breasts.
Surgically?
Yes.
Well,
and when it's gone is gone. When they finally come around to embracing their gender, it's too late. They've lost their fertility, they've lost their breasts, and they're moving to also have castration at earlier, the possibility of that bottom surgery, as they call it, at earlier and earlier ages. They're pushing for that now for minors.
It really is a stunning degree of I don't know what else to call it, bullying by the state legislature on this issue. I want to get back to Matt Sharp for a moment. Matt, where are we with this legislation in the legislative process, and how much time do people have left to lobby their legislators to say, I don't accept it?
Yeah, so fortunately we were in the very early stages of all of this, so there is a lot of time, and it's one of the reasons we need to speak out on this issue now before it starts gathering steam, to let people know you've got to speak out on this. This is a broad, sweeping bill that goes far beyond anything we've ever seen anywhere else in the country, of really proscribing speech, of banning counseling, banning help that a lot of people are wanting to receive.
Well, and that is an interesting distinction that we really hadn't talked about here, was this even applies if the person in question seeks out the counseling and wants it.
Well, here's the crazy thing. I think many of us have seen, either on the cover of a magazine or something, Caitlyn Jenner, Bruce Jenner, who now goes by the name Caitlyn.
Right.
Let's imagine, I want to be respectful. I've never met Bruce/Caitlyn, but let's imagine that this individual decides at some point in the future, you know what? I was confused. I believe that I was wrong. I want to embrace my biological male gender.
Oh, and listen, medical literature and just news covering the subject is replete with people who have had multiple surgeries. They've gone there. I think there's a guy in Europe who's on his 5th.
Right. Well, so in this case, if Bruce Jenner,
at least I think he's a guy.
Right. Well, right. After this bill is passed, or if it was passed, I should put it that way. Hopefully, it will not be. But if this bill was passed under AB 2943. If Bruce Jenner went to a licensed clinical psychologist like Dr. Laura Haynes and said, you know what, I believe I've made a mistake. I want to embrace my God-given biological gender, Dr. Haynes or any other clinical doctor in the state of California would be legally barred from even discussing it with them. A pastor would be legally barred from counseling Bruce Jenner. Bruce Jenner would not be able to attend a conference in the state of California. He would not be able, Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, but he wouldn't even be able to buy a book on Amazon.com that had to deal with affirming his God-given biological gender identity. I mean, Phil, that's insane.
It is insane. And a quick question for you, Matt. If I go to a member of the clergy in my church, what is the consideration involved there? Why couldn't that person talk to me about this?
Yeah, that's exactly one of the concerns, is because a lot of people would say, well, look, you're paying tithes, something like that, and so now this is a service that's covered by all of this.
So if I contribute to the church, that's the consideration,
that's right. That's
a voluntary contribution?
Yeah, because the way this law is worded, it says this should be construed broadly, and so anytime there's any sort of transaction, exchange, something like that, it says at that point you cannot engage in these discussions. You cannot even just say, hey, maybe these attractions you're feeling are not really what the root cause is. Maybe there's something else we can explore. At that moment, this law is triggered, and now that pastor, that counselor, is subject to ruinous lawsuits under this bill.
It's 7:17. We've got to pause for a break here, but I encourage you all, and I know we're preaching to the choir here in this audience. A great many of you are already served by Republican legislators, none of whom I would hope would vote for such a thing. But certainly lobby them, and if your state legislator might be somebody like, Richard Pan, please, by all means, call his office and voice in the most strident terms possible your opposition to this, because this is craziness, and this is the kind of bullying that needs to be stopped on the part of left-wing politicians. We'll have more on this discussion about a Supreme Court case that's being argued right now when we return here on The Phil Cowan Show. Good morning and welcome. 21 minutes past 7. Happy Friday, everybody. We are still with our guests, Jonathan Keller, who's the CEO of the California Family Council, Matt Sharp, an attorney with Alliance Defending Freedom, and Laura Haynes, a licensed clinical psychologist here in California and a PhD. This case that is being argued right now before the Supreme Court, it is referred to as the California Reproductive Fact Act, and I think a lot of Californians don't even know it's here and don't know this case is being argued. Tell me what it's about.
So this case, Phil, when AB 775 was passed back in 2015, I remember being in the room, and there were pregnancy care center directors from all across the state that were lobbying in opposition, because what this basically does is turn the walls of their clinics, pro-life pregnancy resource centers, into billboards for the abortion industry. And that's not my opinion. That's the opinion of a judge from Southern California who actually invalidated it for a single clinic. They basically said that this is unconstitutional. And fortunately now our friends at ADF, Matt's boss, Dr. Michael Ferris, formerly of Homeschool Legal Defense Association, they're going to be arguing this in less than 2 weeks, Tuesday the 20th of March. And the question is whether or not the government can step into a private faith-based organization like a pregnancy center and tell them you have to refer for abortions inside your clinic. Not just on your website. You have to post huge notices on your walls and tell people where they can get a state-sponsored abortion.
Well, do they conversely require that if I walk into a Planned Parenthood center, there is a sign there directing me to a pro-life pregnancy center, if that's the choice I make?
Well, let me put it this way. Our good friend, and I'm sure you've met him before, James Gallagher, assembly member from
yes.
the Marysville area.
I've spoken to him on the phone.
He had that very same idea, so he introduced a bill the next year that would require exactly that. He said, hey, look, turnabout is fair play if you're going to do this.
Listen, that is the fair and equitable thing to do.
And as you sadly might expect, it did not even make it out of committee on a party line vote. Every Democrat rejected that idea that you should have to require that.
But they would require pro-life counseling to make available information where you can get a state-funded abortion.
With massive penalties of fines and all sorts of horrible attacks if you don't do this.
Now, where does the case currently stand in the appellate court, and who petitioned this to the Supreme Court?
Yeah, so this we had lost at the Ninth Circuit, and so this was NIFLA.
Oh, there's a shock.
Yeah. So this was them, sort of their last chance to go to the Supreme Court and ask for relief on all of this. Fortunately, several other courts across the country have had a little more common sense and recognize this is unconstitutional. You can't compel speech that you disagree with, and so we think there's some strong momentum for the court to strike this down and protect the freedom of these pregnancy centers.
Well, I would certainly hope that they do, and I would hope that the court recognizes, although I'm sure 4 members will not, that this has become all too common a political strategy on the part of Democrats and the left in recent years, is simply to stifle any speech, and not just to publicly shame it, which they've been doing forever, but to try and make it against the law.
Yeah. And to me, this is when you're telling a organization that's devoted to saving life, you must now advertise for the very thing that you are fighting against. It's analogous to telling the American Lung Association, you need to be advertising for cigarettes. I mean, it's just nonsensical that you would tell
you know
groups.
what? And that is not an inapt analogy. It would be like somebody at the American Lung Association counseling people, now, you can smoke and it may not kill you.
That's right.
It is precisely the same. And this is going to be argued when? Next month?
Yeah.
No, just a week and a half. Tuesday the 20th.
And I presume we'll see a decision in June or July?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, very good. Well, I really appreciate you coming in and talking about these issues. And in particular, AB 2943 is just, that has got to be stopped. I've never seen such an egregious example of Democrats saying the only acceptable opinion that can be expressed is the one we agree with.
Yep.
And that's exactly what this bill does.
And Phil, I would encourage your listeners, we're working on our website, californiafamily.org, at putting up some resources and some information. We're going to have some of the talking points that Matt and his team at ADF have put together. So we encourage you, if you go to our website, californiafamily.org, if you follow us on Facebook, just facebook.com/californiafamily, we will have all of our resources up there. I think by the end of the day, we're going to have a whole slew of information for people to share and to get equipped with.
Well, and it's time to mobilize on this issue. We were discussing it during the break there, and Dr. Haynes, I think, was correct in saying this may be the watershed moment when Californians, at least those of any reasonable conscience, decide this is enough.
I think this pulls back the veil and exposes that what it's been about, going after licensed professional therapists to ban therapy, what it's been about is going after the church.
Yeah, and that really is, as I said in our opening segment, this is as much about delegitimizing the views of Christians as anything else, and not allowing you to express them. And that just simply cannot be tolerated. Anyway, I thank you all very much for coming in. We've got a break for news here. Have a great weekend. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
727 AM 1380, The Answer. I will post on our Facebook page as well, the californiafamily.org site, where people can go and get more information on how they can mobilize to try and put a stop to this lunacy. You know, I'm having to say that way too often in this state these days. 727 News is coming up next.